රිදෙන ජීවිතේ. දශකයක ගමනක් ඔබත් එක්ක ඔබට සවන් දෙමින්. ගමේ දුක හදවතින්ම දකිමින්. දැනෙන යාදෙන විසඳුම් දෙමින්. අකණ්ඩ ජන පෙරටු ගමන. ගම්නැද්දේ දර්ශනයයි. සද්භාවයත් සත්‍ය කරුණු පදනම් කොටගෙන ගම්මැද්ද පෙරට යන්නේ ජනතාව සමගින් ජනතාව උදෙසා. ගම්මැද්ද රට නගන ජන පවුර.
Newsfirst, NEWSLINE.
Very good evening and welcome to another edition of NEWSLINE. Today, unfortunately, we're not coming to you live. This is a recorded show. Because of the circumstances, we had to resort to making this recording off Zoom. But nonetheless, getting to know our guest for this evening. He's none other than attorney at law, Louis Ganeshadasan. He's also a legal researcher. A very good evening, Louis, and welcome to the show.
Good evening.
So many questions surrounding the law, the constitution, the people's mandate right now, because we are not only facing a grave economic crisis here in Sri Lanka, we're also facing now a political crisis because of the massive uprise of the people demanding for solutions from a system that people themselves allege is corrupt, or has been corrupt for the past 70 odd years since independence here in Sri Lanka. So all of these issues that have been boiling up and all of these problems that we kept on postponing, saying, you know, we'll solve this with the next government, we'll solve this with the government after that. It was the fault of the previous government that we weren't able to solve this. All of these issues have now come and hit us all at once. Let's start off from the appointment made yesterday of the new Prime Minister. Right after the appointment was made, we saw various factions coming out and expressing their support for the appointment. Many international factions came out and expressed their support. Locally, we also had certain factions coming and expressing their dissent against this appointment, chief among them being Venerable Omar Pesobidathera and Cardinal Malcolm Ranjit. Now, Cardinal Malcolm Ranjit specifically said that Ranil Wickremesinghe has only one seat in parliament. The United National Party has only one seat in parliament. So appointing such a person as the Prime Minister of the country, as a person who commands the support of a majority in parliament, is unconstitutional. He went on to say that the appointment cannot be accepted. Is this appointment really unconstitutional?
The legal standard that our constitution requires is that the president has to form an opinion that the person he's appointing as a member of as the Prime Minister has the confidence of a majority of the House of Parliament. Now, we've actually had case law in Sri Lanka, where the Supreme Court has said that this opinion can't be a subjective opinion. It has to be an objective opinion. He has to have a basis for this opinion. He can't just pick a random person and make them Prime Minister. And these Supreme Court judgments have come in the context of provincial councils, which have similar constitutional provisions. Now, this is where it gets a bit complicated, because from here now we move from the legal realm to the political realm. Because one of the clearest ways you can test whether he has a majority support or not is through a vote of no confidence. Now, in certain other countries around the world, when you're appointed as Prime Minister, you have to have a vote of confidence, showing that you have the support of the majority of the House. Sri Lanka doesn't have that. What we have is a system where if Parliament feels the Prime Minister doesn't enjoy its confidence, it can table a vote of no confidence. Any MP can table a vote of no confidence. And if the vote is passed, the Prime Minister loses his seat and the cabinet stands dissolved. So, but it's a question as to whether the opposition would want to do this, because the opposition has to make a political calculation whether at this stage in time, whether it's the wise thing to do, whether that will make them be seen as being obstructionist or being seen as wanting to be power hungry rather than thinking of the country. And you saw a similar situation in 2015 when again, Mr. Wickremesinghe was appointed Prime Minister after the presidential election in January 2015, where the United National Party only had 50 to 60 MPs in parliament. But the opposition then at that time, the UPFA, who had just lost the presidential election, didn't want to bring a vote of no confidence in because they thought it was not the best political move at that time. So because of that, Mr. Wickremesinghe was able to continue from January 2015 to August 2015 until the parliamentary elections at that time. And in between, you had the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. Now, again, all of this revolves around the question as to what we think about public political stability. One of the ways we can think of political stability is the idea that you have a prime minister and a cabinet of ministers which is governing the country. Because from Monday evening till yesterday evening, we did not have that. But the problem is then we have to, what we have to ask ourselves is, last Sunday, we did have a prime minister and a cabinet of ministers. But do we consider that our country was stable at that point? Was there political stability at that point of time? And I would think, again, no, there wasn't political stability because there is very clearly, because of the protests that we see across the country, a very clear message from the public that they have lost confidence in the institutions of state. And actually, what we should be looking at is how do we deal with this political instability, because that is the main problem we have in order to being able to solve our economic problems.
So speaking on this debate between constitutionality and public policy, you said that the president must make an objective call. He must show reason. Do you think this recent appointment has reasons behind it? Is it, in your opinion, an objective decision? So
the answer to the question as to whether the president could have reasonably formed an objective opinion that Mr. Wickremesinghe had the support of the majority of members of parliament, my personal opinion on this matter is that I don't see how he could have done that. I don't think he could have done that, President, because Mr. Wickremesinghe, again, is from a political party that only has one MP in parliament. And the only way he could say to have the support of the majority of members of parliament is if the SLPP supported him. But the SLPP right now is not a monolith. It has several different factions which are operating inside it, and some of them are sitting in opposition. So far, what we've heard throughout the day from members of parliament sitting in opposition is that they will not extend support to Mr. Wickremesinghe's government. Some have said that they will support certain initiatives that he would bring. Others have outright come and said they wouldn't support his government. So in this context, it doesn't seem like Mr. Wickremesinghe has the support of 113 members of parliament.
But you mean to say that even if the Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna alone, not the Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna alliance, but the SLPP, the party itself alone, even if all the MPs in that party supported Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe, he still wouldn't have enough support?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer because we don't know how many members of parliament are with the Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna in government right now. Over the last several weeks, we saw so many different factions that operate within the SLPP, including I'm not talking about the alliance, I'm talking the Podujana Peramuna party themselves, who bought several proposals out. And if you look at a lot of these proposals, the idea was that you have to have a multi-party government. With Mr. Wickremesinghe at the head of the government, what you have is not a multi-party government. What you have is a government with a large chunk of the SLPP headed by Mr. Wickremesinghe, which is why I said the situation is very similar to where we were on Sunday evening, where we had, the only difference was Mr. Mahinda Rajapaksa was the prime minister at that time. So again, that's why I say I don't think he has the support of the majority.
Many of the opposition parties initially declined the offer to take up the position of prime minister against such a backdrop, without appointing a member of parliament who is already willing to take up the position of prime minister. What other alternatives are there?
So I think a lot of this discussion that has dominated our politics maybe since last evening ignores the main problem. And whether we like it or not, the main problem is that President Rajapaksa doesn't seem to have popular support. which is why you have such a large amount of protests around the country which ask for him to resign. Now, all of these other things we are talking about are things which happen in a context where he's refusing to resign. So on the one hand, we are saying he's refusing to resign, so we need to bring some sort of stability. So what can we do to bring that stability in, right? So that's why, for example, you had, if I'm not mistaken, the NPP led by the JVP and the SJB, both saying they will only take up the invitation to form a government if President Rajapaksa resigns. And then I think there was a bit of a softening of the SJB stance, where they said that if he commits to resign in a particular period of time and to reduce the powers of the presidency in a particular period of time, they would take on the government, right? So part of the reason, so it was not an outright refusal. It was those political parties saying, Mr. President, you have lost confidence of the people, so we can't govern with you. We need to have a fresh start. We need to have someone in the office of presidency that the people will have confidence in. And this is extremely important. It's because if we are going to fix our economy, we will have to make changes to the way we've been operating. Now, on the one hand, there doesn't seem to be an agreement on the part of a lot of people of what these changes exactly are, right? So there are different debates about what changes are needed and what changes are desirable. So in a context like that, you need to include everyone in the decision-making process, so you cover all the different perspectives, and also so you make sure you have legitimacy for those decisions. You don't want to have a situation where there is disagreement, let's say with the president and the prime minister, about what should be done, and there is gridlock and deadlock. That will also be bad. That will also be a form of instability. So that's why there's been a call over the last several weeks to form a multi-party government that can agree to a minimum program which they can implement before we go into an election where people can get a fresh mandate.
Louis, the argument on the part of the president when directed the question, why aren't you resigning? Why aren't you heeding to the voice of the people? He says, or his supporters say, that if the president resigns, the country will, slide into more chaos. They said this about Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa as well. They said if the Prime Minister resigns, the country will slide into more chaos. But they use the same argument with regard to the president's resignation as well. Is there any truth to this?
Well, I mean, if you look in terms of constitutional continuity, the Constitution provides as to what will happen if the president resigns. I mean, a few weeks ago, people were saying that the president can't resign, which was again wrong. The Constitution clearly provides for the option for the president to resign, and the Constitution provides for what happens after the president resigns. And there is also an Act of Parliament, which provides how a new president is going to be elected through Parliament. So constitutionally, there is no truth to that story because there is a clear plan of succession. The issue is then a political one. And it's hard to see how that argument can be maintained politically, especially considering the monumental blunders on policy which the president himself has admitted to, be it on the income tax reduction, the cutting of VAT, the banning of chemical fertilizers, and not going to the IMF earlier. On all of those decisions, the president himself admitted that mistakes have happened. Now, in a democratic society, it's not just enough to admit your mistake. There has to be some form of accountability, because the people have to be able to trust that the next important or next crucial decisions that are going to need to be made are being made by a person who didn't make big mistakes in the past, right? Who has a track record of making right decisions. So if people don't have confidence in those decisions, even if these decisions might be the correct decisions, there is still going to be a lot of popular backlash to that, and we are still going to see protests to continue. Now, again, things could change. People could feel like, no, the risk of prolonged power cuts, the risk of not having food, not having medicine is too great. So we will step back and we will let this government continue. I don't know. I mean, I'm not a soothsayer. I cannot read the minds of 22 million people. That could happen as well. That is also a viable alternative. But what we've seen is President Rajapaksa from, let's say, at least the 1st of April, has been hoping that this will happen. And we've seen 6 weeks of political turmoil because he's been hoping that the protests will die down, and it hasn't died down so far. So maybe it will in the next 6 weeks, I don't know, but my gut feeling is that it probably won't.
Right. With that, we will cross over to a short commercial break. On the other side, we'll speak about more issues. You spoke about accountability. There were, amidst this political turmoil, there were various incidents of violence that were reported in Sri Lanka. People are expecting accountability, and that has been included into the agenda of the protesters opposite the president's office. We'll get into those details and more after this short commercial break. Don't go anywhere. You're watching Newsline.
Newsfirst, Newsline.
New Prime Minister assumes duties. UNP explains the way forward. Will the Prime Minister obtain a majority in Parliament?
රජයට සහයෝගය දෙන්නේ නැහැ. අපි ඉන්නේ සෑම විටම පොදු ජනතාව සමග.
හැසිරෙන ආකාරය අනුව තමයි 113 ඒක නෑ කියලා පෙන්වන්නම මොනවා හරි කරන්නේ නෑ අපි.
No deal Gama established opposite temple trees. A change in the power cut schedule for next week.
Newsfirst, Newsline.
Welcome back. You're watching Newsline. We're in discussion with Louis Ganeshadasan, attorney at law and legal researcher. If you're joining us just now, just a recap of what we discussed before. We were speaking about the constitutionality of the appointment of Ranil Wickremesinghe, whether he has support in Parliament. And just before the break, we promised that we will bring a little bit of insight into the accountability measures with regard to the violence that was reported. I'm pretty sure many of our viewers would have seen the massive amount of footage that's been circulating on social media since this Monday, since this incident began. Louis, there haven't been any arrests. 0 arrests have been made. And people are a bit confused. I myself am very confused as to how no arrests have been made with so much of evidence available. As an attorney at law, you would have seen these kind of matters. You would have come across these kind of matters in your professional life. Is there really not enough evidence to make an arrest even 5 days down the line?
Sorry, this is problematic. The fact that there has not been any arrests over the last 5 days. And again, this leads to the question of legitimacy of institutions. We have a population of people who don't trust in the president, who are putting up banners saying all 225 parliamentarians should go home. And we want to make sure that people have confidence in law enforcement and in the courts in this country, because it is not a good situation when people lose confidence in all their institutions. We had a glimpse of what that might be last Monday evening, and I think everyone can agree that that's not a good situation. So it's imperative that these investigations go ahead and people are arrested and brought to account. What you have seen so far in the last few days has been pushers from outside, especially from the Bar Association of Sri Lanka, then the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka, and also we saw a letter from the Attorney General's Department directing the police to expedite these investigations and make sure these people are brought to account. We did see yesterday quite a significant move in the travel bans being issued on, I think, 15 or 16 persons, including the former Prime Minister, which is also an important move. But again, that is not going to be enough. Sri Lanka has had a history of this sort of political violence, and it has had a history of impunity for this sort of political violence. And we are in a very dangerous situation right now, and we should be doing everything we can to make sure people have confidence in our institutions. So it's imperative that the police make sure that investigations are properly done and the perpetrators are arrested and charged before the courts of law.
Louis, just to put these matters into perspective to the general public who maybe might not be too acquainted with the court process and what's required as far as evidence goes. Say, for example, I host a meeting in my house with a group of my friends, let's say, and I speak to them about this enemy who I have, who is my neighbor. And I also provide them with certain equipment, maybe certain weapons. And I say, you know what, come on, let's go. Let's teach him a good lesson. And all of this is caught on camera. How long do you think before the police comes to me?
First of all, I have to make a disclaimer that I'm not a criminal lawyer, in that I don't usually prosecute in criminal, don't appear in criminal courts. But of the criminal law that I understand, and if you look at how arrests have happened in the past in this country, I would think they would come for you pretty fast. But you have to also remember that we are not just talking about the ICCPR Act or the penal code provisions, which we have a history in this country, especially over the last few years. They have not been implemented fairly across the board. That's
misinterpreted or misused.
They have been clearly misused. And we've seen cases on this, and this is not a contentious thing I'm saying. But on top of that, you have President Gotabaya Rajapaksa issuing a state of emergency and promulgating very broad emergency regulations, which the government says was done on the 6th of May, right? And if you look at those emergency regulations, a lot of the things that happened on the 9th of May would fall very comfortably within the purview of those regulations. And those regulations are so broad that even if you fail to give, not that you made a speech, someone was making a speech, you were standing next to them and you failed to report that, that is still considered an offense under those regulations, which could lead to prison time for you, right? So these are very broad regulations. So you have the normal law, which has been misused over the last several years, and we've seen how it's been done. On top of that, you have what are very broad criminal offenses created by emergency regulations. So there is no question, at least in my mind, that there is no legal avenue to deal with these things. There are legal remedies for what happened on the 9th of May. The delay, what you have, I don't know, I cannot explain that. It is something which I think we should ask the police as to why there has been a delay in terms of making arrests and informing people, the general populace, about the progress of investigations. I think it's very important that law enforcement officers take it to their minds that we are in a very precarious situation, and they have to be seen as administering the law impartially and doing their jobs impartially. If not, we will have a very undesirable situation, and we saw a glimpse of that last week, and we can all agree that we don't want that situation.
Louis, one question on the minds of a lot of people is the fact that the police department themselves have been named as respondents in some of these applications that have been made to the Human Rights Commission and to various other judicial and quasi-judicial bodies here in Sri Lanka. At such a time, when you hand over the investigations of these matters once again to the police department, who are respondents in these applications, there is, of course, a question of impartiality that arises again, as you quite rightly mentioned. Is there any other recourse available here in Sri Lanka instead of the police doing the investigations? I think the answer is pretty obvious, but just to hear it from you.
Well, the answer is no. But you have to have the police doing the investigations. So again, the situation that you pointed to is another example as to why it's so important for the police to make sure that they are doing the investigations in a way that they will garner public confidence. If they don't, I mean, we've had a history of nothing happening. Investigations are announced, committees are announced, commissions announced. Then the hope is people will forget and then things will move on, right? I have a sense that this moment we are in right now is slightly different. And I hope that the people who have the power understand that and don't expect the people to react in the same way they've been reacting for the last so many years, and that people will just forget about it and then in a few months we can move on. That's not going to happen. So we need to make sure that we don't erode the confidence of the population in the law enforcement authorities and the judiciary.
Finally, Louis, we were speaking about political stability for economic stability, and I think the governor of the central bank also highlighted this. He actually presented almost an ultimatum to the politicians of Sri Lanka, saying that, if you don't establish political stability in Sri Lanka in the coming 2 weeks, the situation in Sri Lanka will be, we won't be able to salvage the economy of Sri Lanka, and that he is going to leave. So against such a backdrop now, there are people in Sri Lanka who support the appointment of Ranil Wickremesinghe. There are those who are against. Most of the international community, I must say, are in support of this appointment. There were many well-wishers that came, maybe out of a diplomatic perspective. I'm not sure of that. But however, in your opinion, moving forward on how Sri Lanka should move forward, well, having certain individuals in certain offices is not the best case right now. It's not what all Sri Lankans would like, but it is what it is. The appointments have been made. Where to next?
So this situation for me, and I think the Bar Association pointed this out as well, I mean, it's a moment for statesmen, not politicians, right? So on the one hand, you can just, the opposition can just back down and say, the president has appointed Mr. Wickremesinghe, so let him govern. Or they can say, no, we will bring a vote of no confidence in, and we will defeat his government. All of these have their relative merits and demerits. So, but I think is most important right now, and again, this is my personal opinion on this issue. I'm sure there are lots of different opinions about this, is that you need a situation where all the leaders of political parties in parliament need to get together and discuss and come to an agreement of what can be done in a short time span. Because if the leaders of those political parties in parliament get together and make that discussion, then you're taking the president out of the equation, and he has very little power. If they can get together and agree, firstly, we have to get rid of emergency regulations that we are under right now. They do not contribute to economic stability. They do not contribute to social stability. They are doing the opposite of it. Secondly, we need to have institutional reform, which, if the president is adamant that he's not going to leave, reduces the power of the president and brings back power to parliament. Once parliament has that power, they have to say, this is what we're going to do with that power. These are the things we're going to do in these next few months. And then we will go for an election to get a fresh mandate from the people. It seems like maybe 3 weeks ago, if you asked me, I would have told you we probably can't go for an election anytime soon. It'll just make things worse. But seeing how nothing has happened over the last 6 weeks, and actually the situation deteriorate even further, an election seems to be the best way to kind of arrest this deterioration and have a parliament which probably represents the mood of the country right now. Right? Even if you get that parliament, chances are no one party will have a clear majority in that parliament, and there is nothing that can be done with that. That's probably because that's a reflection of the public mood. Political stability only, there is only political stability if you can ensure that the politicians represent or reflect the will of the people. When there is a mismatch between those two, then there is no political stability in the country by definition, and there is no constitutional provision you can hide behind to kind of help your legitimacy in that situation. So this is a situation which requires political parties to come together for a short period of time to create an environment in which we can go for elections, and then to have, and also in the meantime, to put in place the economic reforms that needs to happen to ensure we can have the IMF, first tranche of the IMF package coming through and inspire confidence enough to get the bridging financing we need in that period. So you need a program like that in the next few months. Outside that program, I don't see a big difference or a big change happening by just changing the personnel around. The Prime Minister, members of Cabinet of Ministers have been changing around for the last almost 2 months now, and things haven't gotten better. So you have to look beyond that right now.
Thank you very much, Louis. Of course, from the perspective of the general public, it seems as if politicians for so long have been united in switching their heads and playing their political games with the people. But now the people are united and the politicians are divided. Thank you very much for joining us on our show and expressing your views on these very contentious matters.
Thank you.
So thank you very much to our viewers for tuning in to Newsline as usual. We will see you again same time, same place, but on Monday. Until then, take care and God bless.
News First.
දුකෙන් ගලවා සතුට දක්වා ජනතාව එතෙර කරන බලාපොරොත්තුවේ පාලම